Welcome to Technovation. I'm your host, Peter High. My guest today is Neal Sample. Until recently, Neal was the Chief Information Officer of Northwestern Mutual. Prior to that, he was the CIO and then the Chief Operating Officer of Express Scripts. And prior to that, he was the CIO of American Express Enterprise Growth, current president of that unit. Therefore, I look forward to understanding more about his pathway from CIO to something definitively above that and why he's continued to return to the CIO role. He's also on the board of Wellfield Technologies and the University of Health Sciences and Pharmacy in St. Louis. And I look forward to hearing more about his pathway to becoming a board level technologist and the value he's contributed and derived from those experiences. Neal, welcome back to Technovation. It's always great to speak with you.
Thank you, Peter. Glad to be here.
Well, I thought we would begin, Neal, with your time at Northwestern Mutual. Not so long ago, we went on the record when you were in the throes of that experience, but you've had a few months now to rest and reflect, no doubt. And I wonder if there are any sort of top line conclusions you've come to about your time at Northwestern Mutual. I would love to have you take a few minutes and talk about that if you would.
A couple of things came to mind as I was reflecting back on the time at Northwestern Mutual. And the first thing was really a bit of a conclusion after looking at multiple roles over the years. And that's one that I always suspected, but I feel pretty strongly about. And that's that the technology function essentially is going to match and mirror the pace and the heartbeat of the business. So if you have a business that is by its very nature, dynamic and real time and customer facing, technology needs to feel the same way inside. If you have a business that isn't as much, is sort of asynchronous, not consumer facing, maybe it's B2B, your technology function will invariably have similar feelings. And I always thought that that was just a little bit of a coincidence, maybe the way businesses grow up. But in stepping back and reflecting, it seems pretty obvious that the business cycle, whether it's the consumer cycle of being in retail and having holiday shopping, or it's the market cycle and planning and budgeting, et cetera, that your tech function needs to sort of go with the grain with the rest of the business, because if it doesn't, it'll be dragged in that direction over time. The second thing I would say, and this is one of the reasons I think Northwestern Mutual is a great bit of evidence towards that hypothesis, is that structurally as a company, it runs very, very differently. So it's a mutual and not public or private, sort of somewhere in between. And it was really around the lessons of what would you do if you had no short-term concerns. And I don't mean no short-term concerns. Every company has short-term concerns, but Northwestern Mutual as a mutual means that there's no equity component, that there's no reporting to the street, that there's no quarterly earnings to meet, that you don't have analysts sort of looking over your shoulder, second guessing you. And it means that you can plan for a long-term future, a long-term horizon. Being primarily a permanent life insurance manufacturer means that they put products out in the market where the expectation is that clients who remain clients after the first 5 years average more than 40 years with the company. So incredibly durable, incredibly persistent. And so then the question is, well, how would you run tech in that kind of environment? And the answer is differently. That there are lessons there about return on equity or return on capital, for example. Data centers are not a dead notion, because if you can break even at 7 years and be ahead between years 8 and years 30 on an asset like that, you would do it. Whereas, contemporary thinking, you would never take on a project that pays off in 7 years or breaks even in 7 years if you've got to return capital to the street. And so a very different way of thinking about technology with more of a long-term view, which I think tempers short-term roles as well.
I appreciate you taking some time to reflect on your most recent role and speaking on your past roles. I mentioned in the introduction that you've been a CIO multiple times over, and you've advanced beyond it multiple times over, from CIO to Group President of American Express Enterprise Growth, from CIO to COO of Express Scripts, and then back to CIO at Northwestern Mutual. And I'm curious, what has been so compelling about the Chief Information Officer role that has had you returning to that role? It would seem to the outside observer that it is a diminution of your responsibilities in some ways. But I know from our many correspondences that there's a lot about the role that make it very interesting as time passes and ever changing. And I'd love to have you reflect on some of that.
Yeah, great question. So I think there are a couple of things there. The first thing I would say is if you like dynamism in your role, if you're happy with the role changing, continuously growing, et cetera, that I think the CIO role is probably, at least in my lifetime, one of the roles that's changed the most. I think there's close competition with like a chief marketing officer, and the drivers behind both of those have been the same, however. That within the CIO function, everybody thinks about technology changing, and it does all the time. But we also are confronted with process changes that vary dramatically the way we would do our jobs. And so, starting in, for example, the 80s, best of breed thinking might have been waterfall. And then you fast forward, say, 15 years, and now all of a sudden it's sort of agile or nothing. And then beyond, say, well, what's post agile? And it turns out it's DevOps or DevSecOps, and other changes that I don't see functions changing that much. So CIO remains interesting because I think there's this constant state of renewal. However, its relevance to the business has also grown over the years. And so, again, back in, let's say, the 80s or the early 90s, the CIO role was really a back office role. And we can see these trends. Many times they reported, for example, to the CFO. They were cost containment, that it was to support internal HRIS, accounting systems, et cetera, that there was far less opportunity to even be client facing or be part of the product set. And so that's changed in such a way that I think is really positive for the role. That coming into a business in the technology function, there's almost no faster way to learn the business because the speeds and feeds of technology, the areas of focus, for example, for investment or reliability, what you need to do to keep the business running, speak volumes about the reality of the business, that may or may not match the external perception. So I think it's an incredibly powerful place to learn about the company as well, and obviously use a skill set that's maybe was deployed differently some decades ago. So I'm pretty excited about where the CIO function has gone and where it continues to grow over the next few years.
Neal, it strikes me I've got a rare opportunity to speak with somebody who's in between roles. We rarely have that opportunity, and as a result, you're not constrained by a communications department of a company you are affiliated with. And I wanted to ask you, if you don't mind, about the complications associated with this set of roles. In many ways, they are growing in strategic responsibility and in terms of the opportunities that can be driven from it, as you have clearly stated. On the other hand, there's a lot at stake. The innovation that should be driven digitally, as well as the issues one needs to guard against, cybersecurity being chief among those. I wonder, with some time now to have reflected, how you would describe the challenges associated with this role.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Peter. One of the things that pops up for CIOs and that's sort of obvious, is the nature of constant trade-off within the business, whether it's short-term versus long-term, or security versus development, or infrastructure investments versus new product development. That there's this constancy of trade-off within the technology area that is can be difficult to manage. If we all had our way, and we were to write down on a blank sheet of paper, what does the technology environment look like? Invariably, most CIOs would have something that's quite a bit different than what they have. At least if they've been at the business for 5, 10, 20 years or more. There's a real deviation between what you wish you had in the toolbox, and what you currently maintain and operate, and what would be best to breed or best practice. And so managing those trade-offs is key to the job, that we don't all have infinite sets of resources and budgets, and that the dollars that are spent on maintenance, for example, trade off with development on the short term. And so that's one of the things that I think is always a struggle for CIOs. But a bigger one, and one that we don't talk about as often, is that internal struggle with the company, where what we know is that at an enterprise scale, bringing together the technology assets collectively makes the most sense, right? To have sort of a single delivery organization, which means you get economies of scale, you get efficiencies of management, you get the ability to globally plan and therefore optimize a portfolio. And so that's a really great thing, centralization. However, you may have business lines, more than one, or product lines, and you may have two or three or four, or in larger companies, maybe it's even broken up regionally and with geographic global geographies. You might have 8 or 10 different stakeholders that all want a piece of the technology puzzle. And so, in that regard, you're absolutely supposed to be operating like Switzerland. But if you are this same technologist that's getting closer and closer to the business, invariably you have opinions and you have perspectives. But you can't let those opinions and perspectives play out, or even let them appear to play out, because yours is ultimately a service job, for example, when you have that type of organizational structure. So, that I think is one of the most difficult tensions, is that you're supposed to not have opinions about what the business is going to do, and you let that process happen and it gets negotiated elsewhere. However, the direct consequence is yours, and that you will feel it. And invariably, you'll get to some point in the year, and there'll be some new value proposition that pops up, and a new business wants to develop a new feature or something, and the trade-off will be against an existing project. And somebody else who works in a different business unit is the leader or the sponsor of that project. And they will turn their eyes to technology and say, well, just fix it, do both of those things. And you'll be in the unenviable position of explaining why you can't do both. And so, you have to manage these problems that are not of your own design. They're not about, hey, listen, this was, upgrading the mainframe, or this was a new client experience. It is a change in the opportunity analysis from the business. It sits in technology, and then technology says, well, here are what the possible trade-offs are. And so you're implicitly making opportunities available, or taking opportunities away from someone else. And that can be very, very difficult to manage. That's the kind of thing that when you're learning about software development processes, is not part of the equation. It's not part of the learning. You don't find this political aspect of the job. And so for me, I think that's one of the hardest things that we don't talk about, that in any large, complicated enterprise, anything that isn't just a single product, small company, no trade-offs to be made, that comes up very, very often, and sort of politicizes what should otherwise be a central, neutral resource at a company. And that's the hardest thing to manage.
That's interesting, Neil. As I reflect on your answer, in many ways, it brings to mind the historical stereotype of the IT leader as more IQ than EQ, and the necessity for technology and digital chiefs to have that balance between, of course, IQ, because these are tough jobs that require a lot of horsepower, brain power, but also EQ, because they are roles where influence of one's fellow executives is paramount. And is that a fair assessment from your perspective?
I think so. And you can use your IQ to offset your EQ, for example. That a really good team avoids most of those trade-offs, right? Like, they figure out how to resequence work, or an architecture team figures out a shortcut or something that can be pushed off or pulled forward to make something easier. And so very often, the best organizations do manage to avoid the hard trade-off. But yes, when that shows up, it's a very, very different set of skills to come forward with, because oftentimes you become sort of that broker between multiple business organizations, and they're not they all want the best for the company, but invariably someone's plans changed. For example, the new idea or the new market or the new sponsorship or the new partnership or the new acquisition, something that just was unplanned shows up. It's still a good idea. And based on, either constraints of the system, constraints of the budget, et cetera, somehow they're happier for you to be the broker and to tell the other team or the other side of the other business unit no. And that's an EQ skill. You're right. We use the IQ as often as possible to avoid the stickier questions, but when they can't be avoided, when there is a hard trade-off, then the role changes dramatically. The things that make you successful in that seat are very, very different than the sort of steady state success model. It's a quite a change and can be quite a challenge for folks who aren't used to it.
What a great synopsis of the ever-changing role of chief information officer, and in many ways how it becomes much more strategic as time passes. I would ask you to take a quick moment about to talk a little bit more about the CIO role and what it is about it that has created opportunities for you to grow beyond it. Great work being done as a chief information officer, translating into broader sets of responsibilities. What are some of the things that come to mind?
It is a really interesting trend to see that the CIO role itself and the individuals who sit in that seat become more and more in demand. We know that they are, for example, on boards. We know, in my own case, as you mentioned, taking on business roles. And I think that again, going just wind the clock back a little bit, used to be a remarkably different set of skills to be CIO. So when you didn't have a digital platform like the internet or mobile computing, you weren't as sensitive to customer needs because the customers were never interfacing with your systems. You didn't have an obligation to support them. Maybe you weren't working closely with operations because that was a very different function. So I think the evolution of the role has made it more business centric, more business focused. I think the evolution of that role has also sort of winnowed the field, if you will, to attract and retain folks who are more business focused in that seat, who are more responsive to the needs of the business. And therefore, it's a natural progression then that they can take those skill sets that are a little different than they might have been before and apply them to other areas of the business. I think the flip side is, or in terms of governance, as you look at boards, it's just sort of obvious that as traditional companies mature, they need more of a technology perspective on their board to meet the needs of consumer or B2B demands. And I also think that the relevance of that seat having not been filled, that board seat having not been filled by a technologist in the past, it's a way to bring a different type of diversity, diverse thinking, at least, to the board, to from the CIO seat.
Well, you mentioned in your response board level responsibilities, and I would love to have you reflect on that a little bit further, if you would. As I mentioned at the outset, you're on the board of Wellfield Technologies, the University of Health Sciences and Pharmacy in St. Louis as well. And I wonder, if you could take a moment and talk a bit about the what boards gain from including a technologist on them.
I think I would actually almost turn that hypothesis around and ask, what board wouldn't be improved with the addition of or substitution of a technologist? What company would not be enhanced by having a richer perspective on technology? And so, again, looking at my own history and the journey that friends of mine have been on, colleagues in the industry, we definitely have seen exactly that trend play out, which is more and more boards are bringing on primary technologists to take at least one seat on their board. And I think that's just the nature of relevance of that seat. It really doesn't matter what business you're in. You're in a B2B marketplace, or you're selling online, or you're doing customer acquisition, you're managing your supply chain, you're managing the back office. All of those things are powered by technology. And all of those things, whether it's sort of top line growing the business, or bottom line, optimizing the business, require expertise and skill in the technology sleeve. And so, for me, I would almost look at it the other way. Like, what board can afford not to? What board is either not got a company that's on a growth trajectory with its technology, or is hampered by technology, maybe isn't on that growth trend yet, but has to, for example, clean up and modernize legacy. I would challenge you and say there isn't a company out there that isn't in some way powered by technology that can afford to have a board that's bereft of technology leaders. And so I think it's the other way. I think the trend is definitely there, but the trend should sort of finish with all boards having somebody from with a tech background on them. It's a little crazy to think about the idea that you wouldn't.
Thank you for mentioning that. I certainly hope that the club that you have joined, still a very elite one of technologists who've joined boards, will have more members like you. You know, Peter Weil from MIT Scissor and some of his collaborators did some really compelling research to highlight that boards that have multiple technologists on it have outsized performance relative to their peers. And hopefully, it's your experiences and data like that that will compel more companies to have peers of yours join those same boards. I wonder also, as you now look to the future a little bit, you keep yourself busy, obviously, with your board work and other activities that you're involved in. What are you plotting for next? What are some of the things that you're excited about as you think about your next professional opportunity?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for me personally, I find myself in an interesting spot in terms of evaluation. And so, we've been pretty successful over the years with some successful exits, for example, whether it's a large public company acquisition or early in my career with small companies. And so, even though I'm somewhat earlier in my career, I'm afforded the freedom to not have to choose a next step immediately. And I've taken that time to reflect. And here's the interesting crossroads. And this is one that I'm sure people invariably struggle with, which is that what to do next. And there are two very different directions. So, as you mentioned, I am senior vice chair of a University of Health Science and Pharmacy, and I also serve on a public board on Wellfield Technologies. And board work takes time, requires depth, the preparation, et cetera. And so here's the sort of crossroads of the conundrum. As you mentioned, a lot of public boards are seeking folks with a technology background. And I could, for example, take on another public board, but in doing so, I think there wouldn't be enough time in life to take on an operating role. And then taking on an operating role, for example, going back to a CIO, for example, while maintaining more than one public board would be sort of an outrageous proposition as well. And so for me, I'm kind of looking at that difference. Should I jump back into a CIO role or a chief operating officer role or a business role, or take more of a portfolio approach and maybe add another public company that is looking for a technology oriented board member, and then maybe throw in some consulting, as a lot of folks generally consider that option. I think later in their careers, it's interesting to hear those perspectives, get my mentors and advisors to give me their best advice and counsel, and we'll see where it goes. But it's an interesting spot to think about, because they are very very different paths. They are sort of crossroads, and you can't really do both simultaneously.
You know, I wanted to also ask you, Neal, in our many conversations, I don't think I've ever had a chance to ask you this. You have a PhD from Stanford in computer science, and therefore have a great weight, breadth, and depth to your knowledge of that discipline for the degree that you have gotten. And at a time where there are many who believe that advanced education is decreasing in importance. You see the number of people that have as a badge of honor of dropping out of elite universities to start businesses. You have Peter Thiel, who's actually putting dollars against that idea and creating a cohort of people who skip college in order to start businesses. You are somebody who has taken the time to get to, at least degree wise, the highest level degree there is in a discipline. And I wonder, you are just one person, and therefore I'm sure can't speak for everyone. But talk a bit about your own thought process about the advantages of more rather than less education. And as someone who's a father, as somebody who advises people who are younger than himself, what advice you would offer to others, the extent to which you do about advanced education.
Yeah, we haven't talked about this before, but I like to think that I have an interesting perspective because I did both. Despite having the PhD, one of the things that is maybe not always obvious is I don't think I graduated from Stanford until I think it was 2004, maybe 2005, something like that. Because while I was in my PhD program, was actually when I went to do a startup with some friends, a smaller company that was eventually acquired by HP. And I did not quite finish the program, and eventually got a letter from the university that said, "Hey, listen, you've been gone long enough that your credits are going to expire, and you'll need to physically come back to school if you want to complete this program. You'll have to turn in your dissertation, all that sort of thing." So I did the thing where I found a great startup and worked with some amazing peers and got that work experience, and then kind of eventually hit a crossroads where it was like, all right, I need to finish this up now and sort of come back or not. And ultimately, the counsel I got was, listen, go back and finish it. Take a few months, take the time off, finish your dissertation, get through the process. And so I did that, but it was years and years later after I started. I was at Stanford in the 90s, starting my PhD program, and it was a very long PhD because I did sort of leave the program and work and do a startup that was ultimately successful. My answer is you can't go wrong either way. Now, I don't know what the world would have liked if I'd finished my startup and continued forward without sort of pausing and coming back. But I would say the formal side of my education was incredibly important. It led to, I think some doors opening that wouldn't be opened otherwise. The most extreme example I can think of, I have a colleague that I've hired a few times who himself was a Stanford dropout, did 4, maybe 5 years there, but actually was consulting and went into consulting and spent time there and did some startups and things, remarkably successful. However, when I was talking about bringing him back into to a particular company we were both at the same time, the HR system, as part of the application process, required you to put your undergraduate degree completion, et cetera, so that they could do the background verification. And we even needed to get an exception to say, listen, there is no degree completion date because there is no undergrad degree. And that was a gating factor on the HR system. And so, at least finishing that undergraduate degree, I think, is critically important, that there are still doors that will not be open, even if you're really good at technology, or sometimes you might get in as a developer or a coder, but wouldn't be considered for growth paths internally. But I think graduate school has been remarkably valuable, but so was that early startup experience, and I don't think you can go wrong at either. The one thing I would say though is sort of finish that 4-year degree, demonstrate that you can follow through, that you're can achieve one of these pinnacle sort of things, because I do think that opens enough doors later on that it's critical. But otherwise, you can't go wrong on either path. So I'd have a hard time picking one of those two as better. I picked both.
That's why you pick both, exactly. Well, you're already getting into some of the topics that I wanted to cover next, which is sort of the secrets of your success. We've talked a bit about some of the difference makers for you of being involved in startups and going back and getting your education, and the important mark that has left for you, and in many ways opening doors for you as well. I wonder if you could take a little more time and reflect on the secrets to your success. As I mentioned, you've reached the highest of heights in a number of scaled organizations. You've worked at world-beating digital native organizations like eBay and Yahoo. You've been with other companies, startups that have been acquired by some of Silicon Valley royalty as well. What have been some of the difference makers along the way for you that you might highlight?
Yeah, a couple of things. One, I would be remiss if I didn't say have great advisors, great sponsors, great mentors. And in my own case, I was fortunate enough to have some of them before I was looking for some of them. And so now I know later in life, of course, that it's super important to pick them out and to bring them in to create your own kitchen cabinet, if you will. But early on, I was lucky enough to just have people show up and provide, advice and perspective, et cetera, even if it was unsolicited and maybe even unwelcome. When you're young, you know everything. And when you're older and more mature, you realize just how much you don't know. Bring those folks in early. That's one thing that I think has been really key to success, because they will give you feedback on the things that are holding you back in a way that somebody else who is maybe generally supportive or maybe even competitive internally just wouldn't. So that what I would say is one factor. And factor two really comes down to your motivation and to figure out what gets you excited about a role. There's this idea, this story of a man walking down a street and he sees a guy laying bricks and he says, "What are you doing?" And he says, "Oh, I'm laying bricks." He walks a little farther along, encounters another man laying bricks, and he says, "Oh, what are you doing?" And he says, "Oh, I'm building this wall." And then he walks a little further on and sees a third bricklayer and he says, "What are you doing?" And he says, "Well, I'm helping build this cathedral." And each of them was doing the job, but had a very different perspective and a very different level of passion associated with what they were doing. And so the other thing that I think has made me successful that I would encourage everyone to do is to figure out what elements of your job are not just a job. Figure out what it is that makes you excited about it, what will generate commitment from you, what is it that keeps you in a particular place, and if you can't find those things, then do something else, right? That the career path, if you want to reach those pinnacle roles, you have to be there for a reason beyond just, hey, I want to reach for the brass ring. You have to figure out what it is that makes you excited, what makes you passionate, and when you do, it will pay off just remarkably. You will feel differently about yourself. People will perceive you differently. You will operate differently. And ultimately, you'll be driving for whatever that corporate mission is in a different way. And I think that makes a difference. It's something that oftentimes isn't discussed. It's not a technology skill, it's not something that they teach you in business school. But if you really do, to your point, Peter, want to get to those pinnacle roles, you have to be distinguished not only for the company but for yourself. And so those are the two things I would say were important. Having a set of mentors and advisors and guidance, somebody who can give you that perspective outside yourself. But then figure out what it is about the business, about the function, about the team, et cetera, that gets you excited. And those two things pay dividends.
Well, I appreciate you going into that detail. What great perspectives those are for all of us to bear in mind as we think about navigating our own careers. I wanted to end with a question about trends. You and I often find time for chats to talk about trends and bandy those back and forth. And I'm curious, from where you are now, what are some trends as you look to the future that have you particularly excited, Neal?
Yeah, and some of those things we can look back on and sort of pass judgment on now. Java and VMs for languages or cloud computing. And I've been a ardent skeptic around the blockchain as a general solution for problems, and like the hype cycle would have you believe. But a couple of things that I think are really interesting right now. One, I would say, invariably, AI and machine learning are increasingly important and not just niche to businesses that try to answer decision support like type questions that rely on predictability. I think that those are going to continue to grow in importance. And in the obvious ways, for example, how to better support marketing and online advertising, et cetera. But in non-obvious ways as well, where entire industries are being upended by better thinking around data. At the same time, it's an area that's sort of fraught with not just opportunity, but risk. As we think about things like moral decisions being made by autonomous agents that are operating things like motor vehicles, or really complicated issues like how do we deal with art that's created by AI? Is there a copyright that adheres to the AI? Or one that belongs to the person on the internet that made the query that drove the AI to do the thing that created the art. It's an area that I think is about ready for a renaissance, even though it just came through one. And I think that has a lot to do with the maturity, the adoption, the enhancement of tools, the art of the possible is very, very different than it was 10 or 20 years ago. So I think AI comes around again as a topic. The other thing I would say that has me really intrigued, and to an extent, it goes hand in hand with AI, or it can, and that's the notion of bots and autonomous agents, both as producers and consumers. And so a lot of people are talking about bots these days as we talk about Twitter and a potential acquisition and how much traffic is real. But the rise of the bot, the autonomous agent, the ability to have it done cheaply at scale presents some interesting conundrums on both sides of the ledger. So we have, bot producers, folks who are or agents who are producing content on places like Twitter, and that's seen oftentimes as negative, like it's sort of spammy, or it's trying to be manipulative, etc. On the other hand, autonomous agents and RPA and that sort of thing in the back office is really useful because it's a productivity device. And then on the flip side, you have consumers, consumer bots. And so you can look at consumer bots as agents or things like ubiquitous computing and sensors everywhere. And you could say, well, those are fantastic inputs to my process. On the other hand, if you have a set of bots that are looking at web pages and consuming advertising dollars, you would say, well, maybe that's fraud or a scam. And so I think the rise of the autonomous agent and the bot network is something that's very much related to AI, but different. And I think both consumer and producer bots are ready for some revelation and maybe some regulation as well. I think that's the one of the next frontiers in technology.
That gives us a lot to reflect on and to review as time passes to see what progress is made in some of the areas that you highlighted. I appreciate you giving that overview. And Neal Sample, thank you more generally speaking for a great conversation covering your career arc, the advances you've made and kind of contributions you have made to a number of great organizations, your reflections on the roles that you've held and the extent to which those examples provide watermarks and highlights for others to follow. Particularly inspiring, as well as not only a look back at your accomplishments, but a look forward to what's to come. It's been a great, dynamic, and interesting conversation. Thank you so much for it.
Awesome. Well, thank you for having me, Peter. Really appreciate it.